Currently, we are not seeing jobs go to native-born Americans. They're going exclusively to foreign-born workers. In fact, there are fewer native-born Americans employed today than there were 5 years ago.
Just as we approach the election, how do you compare Kamala Harris and Joe Biden's economic performance compared to Donald Trump's 4-year term?
Well, I think the best way to do that is to simply to use the Biden-Harris administration's own data. And what they show is a very clear picture where the American people saw their real, or in other words, inflation-adjusted incomes rise under the Trump administration, and they have fallen under this administration. Currently, we are not seeing jobs go to native-born Americans. They're going exclusively to foreign-born workers. In fact, there are fewer native-born Americans employed today than there were 5 years ago before the pandemic. So Americans have really, I think, been left behind in this recovery. On top of that, we have seen the federal debt absolutely explode under this administration. Once you look at not simply the increase in the debt, but also the decrease in the U.S. Treasury's cash balance, you realize that this administration accounts for about a quarter of all the federal debt accrued in America's history. I mean, that's absolutely outstanding. And sadly, there's nothing to show for it.
So we've actually seen more jobs going to foreign-born people than Americans, is that right?
That's correct. In fact, all we have seen over the last year, for example, is our jobs going exclusively to foreign-born workers. In fact, native-born Americans have been losing jobs on net, well over 1 million over just the last year. And that's not the only problem that we're seeing in the labor market. We are increasingly seeing people having to get multiple jobs in order to make ends meet. So perhaps I already have a full-time job and then I have to go out and get 1 or even 2 part-time jobs to supplement my income. So the number of what we call multiple job holders is really growing very quickly. And at the same time, the economy is actually shedding full-time jobs. We are only adding part-time jobs at this point as businesses switch essentially from an expansionist or a very positive economic outlook to a much more pessimistic one.
In terms of jobs data, we've seen recently that in the manufacturing industry there's been a decline. Can you talk a bit about the recent figures as to why there's been this decline in output from manufacturers in America?
Well, essentially, it's just a complete collapse in demand. And it's not that people don't want to buy things, it's that they simply can't afford to buy them at today's prices. And those high prices are a direct result from the government spending, borrowing, and printing trillions of dollars it didn't have over the last 4 years. That has driven up prices everywhere throughout the economy. It's hit manufacturing particularly hard. But I think one thing that's important to note about the jobs in the manufacturing sector is that we just had a very large downward revision in the data, which has not actually yet been included in the official numbers, but will be included once we get to the January report, so the beginning of 2025. And once you include those downward revisions, what you find is that there are 130,000 fewer manufacturing jobs in America today than there were at the start of 2023. So the decline is not insignificant. This is a pretty big drop we're talking about.
And how worried are you about the national debt? As you say, it's risen significantly under Biden and Harris, but also under Trump. He spent a lot of money as well. So how concerned are you about the U.S. national debt?
I am extremely concerned about the federal debt. And I think the key thing here is not so much just the fact that the debt is growing, but growing faster than the economy. And actually, even more important than that is the cost to service the debt is growing much faster than the economy. We just got the latest monthly Treasury statement in the U.S. here. And what it showed was that for the month of August, for the first time ever, we have a fiscal year where we have spent more than $1 trillion just to service the debt. That's not a dime towards principal, towards paying the thing down. We're just talking about the interest. And the scary thing is we still have a whole nother month to go before the fiscal year ends. So this isn't the end of it. It is really the cost of servicing the debt that is going to absolutely cripple the federal budget as it continues to crowd out vital services that the government is supposed to be providing, but won't be able to afford pretty soon.
What exactly has the Biden-Harris administration spent this money on? Is it on the Green New Deal? Is it on sort of climate welfare. Where has this money gone?
Sadly, a lot of money has been wasted on far left boondoggle projects. Some of that does absolutely have to do with this Green New Deal nonsense, where we have spent $8 billion in this country to build a grand total of, wait for it, 8 EV charging stations. So somehow Elon Musk can figure out how to build one of these things for only a few $1,000s. But when the Biden-Harris administration does it, it costs $1 billion. That's not an exaggeration, but I think that's a good encapsulation of all the waste that has been going on in this government, again, for the last 4 years.
When it comes to inflation, can you describe the cost on the American consumer of the last 4 years? How much has their groceries gone up, for example, petrol prices, gas prices, and so on? And is inflation now kind of stabling out? It's not rising as fast as it was.
Well, it's certainly true that inflation is not as bad as it was previously, but that's the equivalent of saying every night when I go home from work, I get mugged and the robber takes some money out of my wallet, but this week he took less out of my wallet than he did last week. So things are still getting worse. They're just not deteriorating as quickly as they were before. So I don't mean to paint an overly rosy picture here and say that we're out of the woods or anything like that. Americans are continuously becoming poorer from the hidden tax of inflation. And the sad thing is that people don't realize where it comes from. It comes from one place and one place only, Washington, D.C. Just how bad has it been the last several years? Well, if we look at the official government statistics, the dollar's lost a fifth of its value in only about 3.5 years' time. That is absolutely atrocious. But those are just the official numbers. You know, we need to remember that some of those metrics don't actually look at real world data. This is the classic case when we look at housing inflation metrics. And so they rely exclusively on rents, not actual home prices, not interest rates. So they don't have a good sense of the change in the average person's monthly mortgage payment, let's say, during one of these volatile periods when both interest rates and home prices go up very quickly. So when you look at those actual real world data, what you find is that just to afford the median price home in this country, so we're not talking a mansion, just the median price home, the monthly payment on that home is 110% higher today than it was when the Biden-Harris administration took office. That's 5 times worse than the official data say the cost of home ownership has increased.
And finally, how does the American recovery from the coronavirus pandemic compare to other developed countries in the G7, for example?
Well, it really depends on how we want to actually measure that recovery. And there's a surprisingly large number of ways to do that. You can look at, for example, what can the average person in those countries afford? What has happened to their cost of living, to their standard of living? Or you can look at what we would call macro level measurements, things like gross domestic product. And the problem with using the latter is that when you have these periods of extremely high levels of government spending and borrowing, you are allowing the government to artificially increase those metrics without actually increasing people's quality of life or their standard of living. And that is precisely what we have seen over the last several years, where despite the fact that the average American is much worse off today than they were 4 years ago by thousands of dollars per year, not an exaggeration, despite that, you have official metrics which say the economy is growing at a robust 3% rate. Frankly, the only thing that's really growing is government.
And do you think, finally, do you think that Donald Trump coming in November, winning the presidential election, could he cause some kind of economic boom? I mean, what are you expecting if he wins?
I would expect that he would repeat his performance from his first administration, just like I would expect another Harris administration to repeat the performance of the last 4 years when she has been in office. You know, past performance may not always be an indication of future success, but the odd thing is in this current race is that both candidates have a track record. That's something really unique in modern American political history. So I think voters don't necessarily have to so much rely on what these candidates are promising to do. They can simply look back at the record.